So much for joining the show today. I do want to start with the simple and straightforward question of how the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is balancing these jobs. What is he delegating, considering his workload is now at least twice what it was?
Well, what I can tell you is that I can't get into the details of the choices the Secretary makes on a moment-by-moment basis, but clearly the President and the Secretary have a very good relationship. They know each other. The Secretary's been there quite often, multiple times a week. And I can also tell you, having joined him on January 20th, is that this is a man who is committed to his work, who has got boundless energy, who enjoys his work. He has been very excited about the trust that the president has placed in him in general. And he's also not someone who's going to do something that if he thinks he can't do it. I don't think there's much that he thinks he can't do. But these are men and women who understand what is happening and what the weight of the world on their shoulders, which they have readily accepted, and they're ready for it. So the president believes in him. The secretary understands what's expected. And he is certainly looking forward to it. In the meantime, of course, the State Department has an extraordinary slate of leaders here, and we certainly are not going to be moved off our mission, which continues to be managed and overseen by the Secretary, to say the least. And the two jobs in many ways do overlap in the sense of foreign policy, national security, and the president's interests and vision. So we don't see a conflict there at all, of course.
Will he be stepping back his international travel schedule to make sure that he's at the White House as the national security advisor typically would be?
Well, I can't, again, speculate on the nature of the choices he's going to make, but I can tell you that I've been on a number of the trips with the Secretary and certainly have seen the then NSA leader, Mike Waltz, present as well. So I think that these are really, as I think we've seen with President Trump and certainly with Secretary Rubio, these are jobs that become enacted through the vision of the person holding them. And they're going to make decisions that are best for the United States and our national security. That's what the president does, and that's certainly what Secretary Rubio has been doing and will continue to do.
Does holding both of these jobs give Steve Witkoff, who's been the president's envoy in many international situations, a wider opening to take on more of the responsibilities that would be traditionally executed by the Secretary of State?
You know, what's fascinating about watching President Trump work, what he has demanded of others with him, and certainly even in foreign policy ideas like how we handle the Gaza situation, is the president handles these situations in a new way. He has a new vision. He knows that in order for the world to work properly and for this government to actually be sustainable, we have to look at things through with a new vision and new ideas. And that includes the nature of our special envoys. These are men and women who have their own sensibility about what's possible. The president knows them well, knows what they can contribute, and he has not been wrong. Up until this point, of course, we've seen with the first term and now this term that same passion drives the president. And it is part of how Secretary Rubio views his work as well. So we are seeing definitely a unique point of view when it comes to how to make these jobs work. But the American people like what they're seeing, and we're going to continue on that path.
Does the Secretary of State trust Steve Witkoff unconditionally?
Well, I can't speculate on the nature of his immediate personal feelings, but what I can tell you from what I've seen and from his comments, from the meetings I've been in, there is an excellent relationship, even a friendship, in order to make these jobs work and this foreign policy work, which you've seen as a hallmark of these first 110 days or so, are a group of people who trust each other, who agree and understand the president's vision, who understand that he is a genius at choosing and recognizing who can make that difference. And he has not been wrong with certainly Ambassador Witkoff, certainly not with Secretary Rubio. And so when it comes to the nature of personal relationships...
So there's no daylight between Witkoff and Rubio?
Not that I've seen, and I've been on certainly most of the trips. Certainly have been in the meetings. I've of course met all of these individuals. I can tell you that there is a camaraderie and a passion and an excitement about being able to make a difference for the people of this country, but also for the people of the world.
Okay.
It is a exciting and remarkable focus on getting peace around the world and focusing on that. It's a once-in-a-lifetime possibility, and the men and women who can do it are in charge right now, and that's exciting.
Was the secretary surprised to hear President Trump name him as a possible successor to President Trump in 2028?
I can't speak to that when it comes to the nature of his own feelings. I do know that, of course, the secretary is completely focused. As you might imagine, you report on this every day. The nature of what's happening in the world. He has this job, and he does have a couple of others, and he's focused on getting the job done and also making sure that people understand the power here at home of foreign policy, of President Trump's vision, but also a traditional point of view about diplomacy, that meeting face-to-face matters, traveling to meet with our partners matters, and that our relationship with certain countries, certainly to the south of us, have got to go beyond borders, that it's about trade and it's about security, et cetera. And that's his vision. It's an overall global vision.
Speaking of countries to the south of us, does the secretary believe that immigrants who are deported to these other countries are entitled to due process under the Constitution?
Well, there's always, of course, due process. These are individuals who have either violated our laws or their visas have been removed.
The president
and they have to be removed from the country. Well, let me speak again about the nature of the State Department and the process that's happening here. If these are individuals, of course, who then have to leave the country and are not able to be accepted or returned to their home country, the secretary's worked very hard at making sure that there are other nations that will accept them. And all through this process,
to the El Salvadorian
you have
president
individuals who've gotten into the country with visas or in a fashion that is through the process, and the dynamic of making a decision if they can stay in the country also involves due process. So I think the nature of how we're proceeding as a department has spoken for itself.
Okay, has Marco Rubio spoken recently with Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador?
Well, I'm not going to speak up to which world leaders the secretary speaks to. He speaks to multiple world leaders every day.
Is he still working on the case
in one
of
fashion
Kilmar
or
Abrego
another?
Garcia?
And I'm not going to speak
is
to
he
his
still working on the case
whether or
of
not
Kilmar
he's
Abrego
speaking
Garcia
with the president.
Is he still working on the case of
I'm
Kilmar
not going to
Abrego
speak
Garcia?
to his work. I'm not going to speak to the nature of the work that he does every day in its details. Clearly, this has been an issue that is. Doesn't mean that just a minute. That doesn't mean I'm the gossiper for the State Department.
I'm not asking you to gossip. I'm asking you for
the State Department. I'm telling you the nature of what it is that I can speak to, and it does not include the day-to-day operations or choices the Secretary of State makes. That's not. No, this is in the forefront for the State Department and the forefront for the Secretary of State, but you're not going to get the nature of the details of negotiations, diplomacy, or the decisions the Secretary makes during his day.
Okay, Tammy Bruce, I appreciate you coming on the show today and hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
My pleasure.
All right. Coming up next, why President Trump wants to reopen the Alcatraz prison. Yeah, that Alcatraz, the one you may remember from the movies. We'll explain.